Hi everyone. Today we will be talking about immigration policy, and especially immigration policy as it's focused on the United States, and the philosophical issues underlying our current immigration policy, the history of U.S. immigration policy, and what immigration policy ought to look like moving forward. The main question that I'll be talking about today is, should borders be open? And in the context of that conversation, we'll want to know what do we mean by opening borders? What are the purpose of borders? What's the moral and historical justification for having borders? And we'll address questions like, do people have a right to choose where they live? Do they not have such a right? And what are the costs and benefits of allowing free movement of people across borders? So these are the sorts of issues we'll be talking about today. Now, just a little bit of background before we continue. I'll give you some personal history, a little bit of my bias. So I'm torn on this issue as a person based in part on my history. So 8 generations ago, a man named Captain James Gary fought for America in the Revolutionary War. He had a son Nathan, who had a son Jesse, who had a son John, who had a son named Rother Gary. Rother is my great-grandfather. I'm proud of that. That is, I'm proud that 8 generations ago in my family lineage, there's an American revolutionary who is part of my heritage. And I hope my children are proud of that heritage too. Of course, my wife is Latvian. Her grandparents fled from the Russians and then the Germans during World War II. And they brought with them a daughter named Linda, my wife's mother. Her first language was Latvian. My wife is proud to be Latvian American, first generation Latvian American. And I hope my children are proud to be Latvian American too. So that's the background that my family comes from. And so that is some of the things that I bring to the table in this kind of conversation. So what are we talking about when we talk about open borders? We might mean something like, we should just abolish the idea of the nation state, get rid of all national sovereignty. And some people do seriously propose eliminating nation states. But I want to say that's not the idea I'd like to consider here today. And the reason that that's not the primary focus of my consideration here today is, one, that's just not politically feasible in the near term, or maybe ever. And by near term, I mean in the next 100 years or so. It's incredibly unlikely that we're going to do away with national borders. Now, the way those borders operate, the way they work, those are obviously always changing. There's always shifts in the way our border policies work within our nation and in others. But the idea that we're going to do away with nation states, that's highly unlikely. Second, to do away with national borders brings with it there's an intrinsic barrier to that, morally speaking, because doing away with national sovereignty, doing away with national borders, would limit some sorts of exclusive organizations, so groupings of people where people get together and say, we would like to be a community and it'll be just us and not other people. And we do that with families, and we do that with neighborhoods, and we do that with states, and we do that with nations. And so the idea that, and we do that with clubs, the idea that we're going to stop allowing people to have exclusive relationships or exclusive associations brings with it some morally questionable implications. Of course, there are interesting moral questions also about the idea of exclusive human relationships, that we would want to have associations with just one group of people and not others. That also is morally interesting. But the focus here is on what the scope of immigration should look like from a moral perspective. So first, I'd like to think about, what are we talking about when we talk about open borders if we don't mean just doing away with nation states? Well, we might mean having no border checkpoints, no entry procedures, that is, no boundaries between nation states. So something like the way the boundaries between states within the United States are right now, where you don't need a visa or to pass through a checkpoint to move from Florida to Georgia to Tennessee to Texas to Montana to Washington. You can travel between these states and all of the ones connecting them without ever showing an ID, without ever passing through a border checkpoint, without ever producing a visa. And the same is also true through most of Europe at this point. So checkpoints have been eliminated throughout most of the European Union. And while that model certainly has advantages and is certainly useful within the United States, has been productive within the European Union, that's not the thing that I'm focusing on here today. The elimination of checkpoints or borders in terms of entry procedures is not the focus today. Although the elimination of checkpoints or entry procedures is possible within the context of national sovereignty. So for example, in America, until 1982 or 1924, depending on how strict you want to be about it, there was no national entry policy in the United States. That is, until 1882, you could just show up at the United States border and enter freely. And then that was mostly wide open for most people until 1924. So the idea that the United States would have border checkpoints is a fairly new phenomenon. But of course we were a sovereign nation well before 1882. It's just that's when when we started having a serious border policy. But again, this is not the proposal that we have in mind. I just mean to say the strength or weakness of borders does not determine national sovereignty. So U.S. immigration policy, its history is, I think, relevant here. So here's just a brief overview of some of the major movements in U.S. immigration policy. So in 1790, the Naturalization Act allowed that free white people residing in the United States for at least 2 years would become citizens. That is, if you came to the United States as a free white person, so not Italian or Irish, but a British person, a German person, in the United States, 1790, for at least 2 years, you became a citizen. Then, in the next major change was in 1868 with the 14th Amendment, which brought birthright citizenship to all persons residing in the United States, overriding the Dred Scott decision. So the 14th Amendment was specifically written to override the decision in Dred Scott, which denied citizenship rights to Scott. So in overturning the decision that kept freed slaves from being citizens, the 14th Amendment gives birthright citizenship to anybody born on U.S. soil who is not an emissary of another nation, by which the clear intention of the legislation was to prohibit people who were working as diplomats and their families from becoming citizens accidentally. But otherwise, if you're born in the United States, you get to be a citizen, and that's from 1868 forward. Now, whether we want to keep birthright citizenship or not is certainly it's a thing that's open for discussion. But that would require a constitutional amendment because it's currently constitutional law. So we'd have to change the Constitution in order to end birthright citizenship, and it's pretty unpopular. About 70% of the population wants to keep birthright citizenship. Now, from 1868 to 1882, not much changed with immigration law. In 1882, there was an Immigration Act which prohibited some people, for the first time, had an actual prohibition on who could and could not enter the country. So in 1882, we had the first border restriction. And in 1882, the Immigration Act said that convicts, lunatics, or people of public charge, that is, convicts, prisoners, could not be brought into the United States. So if you were infirmed in some way, if you were a criminal in some way, then you could not enter the United States and become a citizen. That's from 1982 forward, and that's the first real prohibition we had on who could enter the country. At the same time, we also had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which kept Chinese people from entering the country to some extent. Then from 1882 to 1924, in 1924 we had the National Origins Quota Act, which established a quota system of 2% of the population allocated by national origin. So what that meant was, from 1924 onward, so from 1882, when we first had border requirements, only people who were going to be wards of the state couldn't enter. Also, restrictions on Chinese people. From 1924 forward, the restrictions were heavier, and we only allowed 2% of the U.S. population to immigrate. So if you had 100 people, only 2 people could immigrate. If you had 1 million people, only 20,000 people could immigrate. And the way that percentage was divided was based on the current distribution of people within the country now. So more people could come from countries that were already strongly represented in the national character. So if we had at the time 50% British nationals or people of British descent, then we could have a large number of British people would be permitted to immigrate. We didn't have that many people from Britain wanting to immigrate in 1924. Instead, what we had in 1924 was a large number of Italians and Poles and Russian Jews who were trying to immigrate. And the National Origins Quota Act put real strong limits on the number of those people who were allowed to immigrate. In 1948, the Displaced Persons Act allowed 200,000 people to immigrate, but mostly excluded Jews fleeing the Second World War. In 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act does away with quotas and instead introduced family and employer relationships as qualifications for immigration, so that there's preference given to people who have already got family in the United States, or for people who already have jobs or strong prospects for jobs in the United States. So if somebody will certify that you have a job waiting for you in the U.S., or if you have family already in the U.S., you have preferential treatment in the immigration system, but we no longer have a quota system. In 1986, the last major revision to U.S. immigration policy took place, and that policy provided for long-term residents and agricultural workers to become legal permanent residents. That is, people who were here on short-term work visas, or who had already been long-term residents, had a path towards citizenship, and people who were here on short-term visas, some of them were just given long-term green card status or permanent resident status. And what that did was it moved about 3 million people, some of whom were here as migratory workers without documentation, that is, people who had crossed the border illegally, and some of whom were here on short-term visas, were given a path to either long-term residency or, in the case of people who had stayed on short-term visas, a path to citizenship. Over, I think it was 3 or 4 years the policy implementation period took. And that brought about 3 million people into the country under legal status. So that's the kind of the history that we're working with, and that's the last time we've had a major immigration policy reform was under Reagan in '86. So I know it's like a lot of crazy stuff altogether, but that history is probably helpful to understanding where we're at now. So on the idea of nation states, when we talk about a nation state, what we're really talking about is this Westphalian idea. So after the 30 Years' War, the war between Protestants and Catholics for control over who would run the state in Germany and France and England, there was this roiling battle for who was going to control government. Was it going to be Protestants or Catholics? After that war, there was a determination made that we were going to have secularization of the political system, in order to avoid these kind of wars, and that we would also have no interference in the inner workings of distinct nation states. That is, so after the 30 Years' War, we get this idea in the Westphalian Peace Accords that one state is not going to interfere in the workings or goings on in the other states. And it's that which defines national sovereignty, not the permeability of borders. So these are nation states where people were allowed to pass freely between themselves, but also states in which the authority of the state, the laws that were in place in each state, were sovereign. And so sovereignty is about what laws apply, not who comes and goes. So this is just an important, often mistaken view about the idea of borders, that if we allow lots of permeability in the borders, more movement across borders, that erodes national sovereignty. That doesn't seem to be the case. Although it's also worth noting that the idea of Westphalian nation states where we don't interfere with what happens in other nations has seen a lot of slippage in the last 20 or 30 years, where there has been quite a bit of interference, in fact, in what happens in other nations. So the U.S. interferes quite heavily in the goings-on of other nations, and also the other way around. Nations also interfere pretty heavily with what happens in our state. So the idea of sovereignty, even in the Westphalian sense, seems to be undergoing slippage. So then, what are we talking about when we're talking about open borders if we don't mean just getting rid of national sovereignty, and we don't mean just doing away with all border checkpoints? We might mean something like unlimited immigration with a clear path to citizenship. So maybe. Now that's a genuinely open proposal some people have thought about. Some people assume that opening borders would mean allowing full citizenship to anybody who wishes to immigrate. And some countries do in fact work that way. Many do not. Some countries have wide open borders and allow anybody who would like to be a citizen to become a citizen, whereas others allow massive permeability of borders, but don't allow people to become citizens. So between 1820 and 1860, the Irish composed over a third of new arrivals in America. And so during that period, there was massive resistance to that immigration on the grounds that it would shift what it was to be an American. And at this point, there was no national policy to prevent all of these Irish immigrants from flooding into the country and dramatically changing the character of the nation. And after this massive wave of Irish immigration, there was, in 1882, a policy set to limit immigration. Right? So, what are open borders then? We might mean increasing the number of permanent residents in the country. We might mean increasing guest workers in the country. And with those things, we might mean increasing the paths towards citizenship of those people. So when people talk about open borders, they mean many things. Here, mostly what I'm referring to is the expansion of programs that provide the expansion of programs to provide an open or unlimited number, that is a no quota number, of green cards, and that's permanent residency, and H1 and H2 visas. Those are work visas. So, temporary worker programs, H1 and H2 visas, allow people to enter a country for a given period of time on the grounds that they have an employment contract with somebody in the country already. Permanent residents or green card holders are people who are permitted to reside in the United States indefinitely with the expectation that they will be here permanently. Now, a downside to the expansion of guest worker and permanent resident programs is that we might end up with a nation that looks less like the one that it currently looks like, where we have strong integration between all sorts of different groups, and we might end up with one that looks more like Saudi Arabian society, where you have a relatively small group of people who are citizens of the state and then a relatively large group of people who are non-citizens, who are just subjects of the state because that is the place that they reside and work. That is a thing that if we find disconcerting, we might wish to shift and to provide a path to citizenship for people who are given permanent residency green cards or guest worker visas. So then when I'm talking about open borders, what I'm talking about is expansion of guest worker programs, permanent resident programs, and paths to citizenship for people in those programs. So then the question is, how open should borders be? That is, how much should we expand paths to citizenship, permanent resident green card programs, and temporary worker H1 or H2 visa programs? There's a spectrum here from no boundaries on the number of those visa programs that we permit to stopping them entirely. So how much movement ought we to allow, given that the thing we're talking about is an expansion of those three programs? That is, permanent residencies, temporary workers, and citizenship programs. So, what are the reasons to open the borders in those three ways? I'll give you reasons along three different lines, and we'll consider the criticisms of those reasons as well. So the reasons fall out under three categories: reasons of liberty, reasons of well-being, and reasons of culture. So these correspond to Kantian rationale for opening borders. That is a liberty or rights-based, a freedom-based rationale, a well-being-based or a utilitarian-based rationale, and a cultural, that is a virtue or a character-based rationale for open borders, and also critiques along each of these lines. So under liberty, the case for freedom of movement across borders involves three different I have three different arguments there. The freedom of movement is one. So prima facie, it's unjust. That is, on first face, just on the front of it, it's unjust to restrict a person's movement. Second, freedom from tyranny. People use the freedom of movement to escape from tyrannical oppression, and they ought to be allowed to escape from tyranny. And then freedom of association. Again, prima facie, it's just unjust to restrict with whom a person can associate. So when considering freedom of movement, in order to live a decent life, people need to be able to move around. That is, to have a reasonably acceptable standard of living, you have to be able to have some movement. So restricting a person's autonomy means allowing them. So restricting a person's autonomy, their ability to move, means preventing them from pursuing a decent life. The idea then is that people have a basic right to movement. They have a basic right to move. Now we could mean by movement of physical bodies within space, and sometimes we do mean that. So like in a prison, for example, people have a right to some sort of exercise to be able to move around a bit, and if they can't do that, then they won't have a decent life. They won't have a minimally decent life. Now that doesn't, of course, have to be prison yoga. It could be just walking in circles around a yard. It could be basketball, whatever. I mean, there's room to negotiate what counts as having a minimally decent life, but it's going to be a requirement of that you can move your body around. That's not what we're talking about here, though. What we mean here is movement across physical spaces. Right? That means living a decent life is often impossible unless we can move from our city, move from our town, move sometimes from our state, in order to avoid religious persecution. So the pilgrims here, right? They're moving across the ocean because that's what they needed to do to avoid religious persecution. They couldn't live a decent life free of religious persecution where they were, so they moved in order to avoid that persecution. They escaped from that persecution by exercising this right to movement. We also can't live a decent life in conditions of famine, and so the Irish, during the potato famine, they exercised this right to movement based on the idea that they want to live a minimally decent life and can't do that in the midst of a famine. So they exercise this right to move. people who are experiencing ethnic, sexual, gender, or racial persecution. Here we have a bunch of Jews fleeing the Holocaust, right? These people are unable to live minimally decent lives under Russian and German oppression in the 1940s, and as a result, use or exercise this freedom of movement, this right to move, to escape their current confines and find a place where they can live a minimally decent life. You also can't live a minimally decent life if you have no economic opportunity. So if you live in a place where the living standard is most people live on $2 a day, about 2 billion of the people on the planet live in situations something like that, you can't live a minimally decent life on that kind of economic opportunity. And so some people have chosen to exercise a right to movement to find a place where they can live a minimally decent life. This might also mean escaping disaster. All right, so here we have an image from 2010. This is the earthquake or image rather from 2013. This is the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti that happened in 2010. So in 2010, this village is destroyed, and 3 years later, because you have very low economic opportunity, combined with disaster, you've got people living in desperate poverty. And these people would also like to exercise this opportunity to move so that they can find a decent life. Now, minimally decent lives, of course, can be had in many places for most people. Movement to accomplish a minimally decent life doesn't have to be entirely open. That is, the entire world doesn't have to open itself up to allow for people who are in these desperate situations to find minimally decent lives. The only requirement is that there be an adequate, not an optimal, range of possibilities. So of course the best case scenario for people in these situations would be to immigrate to Switzerland or Norway or the United States or Germany or Denmark, right? An advanced, economically powerful country with big opportunities, right? This is the best case scenario, of course. But you don't have to have the best case scenario available. What you have to have in terms of immigration is open opportunities for a good enough life, for a minimally decent living standard. So some limits on movement may be defensible on the basis of the fact that you don't have to have an optimal range, that the right to movement is based on only needing a minimally decent life. So a second sort of liberty-based argument, a second deontological style argument, is based on freedom from tyranny. So people often want to leave their nation, that is, they want to emigrate, and are prevented. So when somebody wants to flee tyranny, there has to be, in order for them to get out, a right to exit. Right? That is, people must have the freedom to leave the country that they're in. That is what it would be to have freedom from tyranny, is to be able to leave the country that you're currently in. But in order for that right to amount to anything, in order for emigration to be meaningful, you also have to have the ability to immigrate, where immigrate is the movement into another nation. So migration, to free oneself from a tyrannical ruler, you have to have liberty on both sides of this. You have to have, first, the ability to leave one's country. That is, you can't be shackled in the country or imprisoned for wanting to leave it. You have to be issued a passport if passports are a requirement for travel. People have basic rights to those things, and if those rights are inhibited, then a moral wrong has been done to them. But beyond that, people who are fleeing tyranny also have to have another country that will not inhibit their entry, that will provide visas and allow them into the country. So fleeing tyranny requires, one, that the country that's tyrannical allow you exit. And we all, I think, agree that it would be inappropriate for a country to force its citizens to remain. On the other hand, that the freedom from tyranny also requires that at least some other country allows you to immigrate. So forcing a person to remain in a country is intrinsically tyrannical. Refusing to issue a passport, threatening, intimidation, at the end incarceration, these are obviously unjust. These are unjust limitations on freedom. Now, there's a separable but also interesting question about when a nation may secede. So, like if a group of people within a country decide they would like to leave that country as a matter not of geographical location, but they would like to form their own country as a separate entity. That's an interesting question about when it becomes tyrannical to make people stay in the country or stay a member of the association. So that's for another day. So where there is a right to emigrate, that is to leave your country, there also has to be a corresponding obligation for some nation to accept immigration, that is to allow you to enter. So when we find rights, if you have a right, there's always a corresponding duty. And in this case, if the right is to be allowed to leave, the corresponding duty has to be that you don't prohibit somebody from entering. Right, so if I have a right to leave my country, then you have a responsibility to not prevent me from leaving my country. That's what it is to have a right to leave, is that there's a responsibility for nobody to prevent me from leaving. And if there's nowhere else for me to go, then I'm effectively prevented from leaving. So a right holder always has a right against somebody, a corresponding duty holder. So the obligation to accept immigration, though, is diffuse, because no specific country has the obligation to accept these immigrants who are fleeing from tyranny. And that's a troubling problem, because diffusion of responsibility has some really terrible consequences. If an immigrant, or if a potential immigrant is fleeing tyranny in his own country, that is, he wants to avoid the oppressive political regime or economic regime of the country that he is a part of, and is able to make it out, only to find a whole room full, or a circle of, say, countries all saying, yes, somebody has to let him in. He has a right to leave his country, so somebody's got to let him in. Then the question is, who will do it? Because we all have some share of the obligation, but no single person has the specific obligation. And so then we end up with the problem of the diffusion of responsibility. So Kitty Genovese is the sort of standard case of the bystander effect. Kitty Genovese was a bartender in Brooklyn, and she was a bartender in Manhattan who I believe lived in Brooklyn in 1972, I believe. And she was working late one night, returned home to her apartment at something like 3 o'clock in the morning, and as she was walking to her building, she was stabbed twice. She screamed. Somebody said, "Hey, leave that woman alone," and the attacker fled. Well, she fell down on the stoop of her building, bleeding. 25 minutes later, the attacker came back, stabbed and killed her and raped her on the steps there. And nobody called the police. And nobody said anything. Nobody stopped the person. Although the report in the paper the next day said more than a dozen people witnessed the attack. And nobody called the police because they all thought somebody else would do something. That somebody else would stand up and do something. And it turns out that this effect has been replicated in a number of studies since then. If you put somebody in a room and start pumping smoke in, like stage smoke, through the ventilation system, they immediately say, "Oh, there's a fire somewhere." They go to look for help. But if you put somebody in a room with 4 or 5 actors who are told to just ignore the smoke, the person who's the subject just sees that everybody else is ignoring the problem, and so they also ignore the problem until the room sort of fills up with smoke. You can find this on a quick video search if you want. So when you're the only one who can do something about it, you're very likely to act. But when it's a responsibility shared amongst many, everybody is very unlikely to act. And this becomes a real problem if we recognize that in the case of immigration, there's a diffused responsibility to accept immigrants who are fleeing from tyranny. And it seems like that's the situation we find ourselves in. So there's a disturbing psychological propensity in cases like that that is going to work out badly for potential immigrants. Okay, so then final element of the considerations of freedom. If two or more people wish to continue or enter into a relationship, other people, prima facie, should not be allowed to interfere without good reason. That is, if I want to be friends with somebody, or I want to get into a business deal with somebody, that's nobody else's business unless they have some good reason to interfere. So when a society limits immigration, it does so at the expense of people who would choose to associate with one another, citizens, residents, and foreigners. So if we think we should be able to have whatever association we like with other people, and that strangers should stay out of it, then we need a good reason to say, no, you can't have that relationship with that person because they live over there. So, as an example, if Bill wants to hire Amir, and Amir wants to work for Bill, I presume they have a right, all things being equal, to form that relationship. Now, what if Bill lives in the United States and Amir lives in Canada? Can Bill still hire Amir? Or is there some problem with that we should interfere with that freedom of association? Or similarly, if Amir wants to rent a house from Bill, but Amir currently lives in Canada, and Bill has a house for rent in the United States, is there some reason Bill can't rent that house to Amir? Prima facie, without some good reason, freedom of association would suggest that if Bill wants to hire Amir, he ought to be allowed to. And if Amir wants to rent an apartment from Bill, he ought to be allowed to, independent of where they currently live. Now, some people argue that the presumptive right to free association in the market might be regulated if the freedom carries too great a cost. So that is, some people worry that increased immigration is going to mean lower wages and higher unemployment. So the idea would be, we have a right as a society to interfere with some of our members' choices. So if somebody in the society wants to hire an immigrant, somebody else in the society wants to rent a house to an immigrant, we can stop them. We can stop our own citizens from having the relationships that they want to have because we say it's not good for the rest of us. Right? What that's going to do for the rest of us is it's going to mean lower wages and higher unemployment. And so we say members of our own society don't have this freedom of association because of the consequences for everybody else. So there's a kind of utilitarian limit, you might think, to this freedom of association. Now, whether or not this is true or false, whether this is defensible, depends in part on the utilitarian claim. That is, will we actually have lower wages, higher unemployment? And it also depends on whether or not you think the greater good, the utilitarian calculus, ought to limit your rights to associate with whomever you choose. So, freedom of association also comes in less economic forms. A more intimate form of freedom of association involves the liberty to be with one's children, one's spouse, one's immediate family. So freedom of association in this form, in our current immigration policy, has been variously called family reunification or chain migration. And the claim is that people have a prima facie right to be with their families. And so laws allow U.S. citizens and legal residents to sponsor immigrants who are their immediate relatives. So sponsorship under family reunification or chain migration only allows spouses, children, siblings, and parents. So not cousins, not uncles, not aunts, spouses, children, siblings, and parents. And spouses and the minor children of those immigrants have priority. So there are caps on national origin and how many people an adult can sponsor. And what that means is that for spouses and siblings, or rather for spouses and children, family reunification happens more or less quickly. That is usually the wait time for family reunification for permanent legal residents, green card holders, or citizens of the United States. How long it takes for a green card holder or a citizen of the United States to have their spouse or children brought into the country usually ranges between 2 and 7 years to get back into a living relationship with your children or spouse. To sponsor the migration of a sibling, your brother or sister, or your parents, very often takes between 10 and 20 years. And depending on your national origin, if you're from a country that has high levels of immigration, a 20-year wait is not uncommon. So now, the justice case for open borders. Right here, we're talking about the kind of the case from justice. First, people each have an intrinsic dignity or worth as humans. But that intrinsic worth, while equal, is not reflected in the opportunities and outcomes that people have, which are definitely not equal. So if we're all born with equal intrinsic worth, and then we have radically different opportunities, chances. So if you're born in Honduras, your chances, your opportunities are dramatically lower than they are if you're born in the United States. That's why it's so great to live in the United States. Great opportunities. Those opportunities mean that people with equal intrinsic worth, with better opportunities, have much better outcomes. Now, additionally, there are significant overall advantages in efficiency and production and distribution to be gained by having open borders. Right, so one justice case for open borders is equalizing opportunity. A second justice case for opening borders is that if we work together with open borders, we can create a bigger economic pie rather than for competing for a small slice of the pie. So when we're thinking about economic justice, this is the scale distribution of wealth across the planet. By income group, the largest, the most common, statistically the mean, about 50% of the world lives on between $2 and $10 a day. That is between about $700 and $4,000 a year. That's your most statistically common demographic. That's most people on the planet. Now there are some people who are dramatically poor, like radical poverty, under $2 a day. These are the people who are not able to afford antibiotics, don't have clean drinking water, are likely to die of famine. These are people in real desperate poverty. People in this low income category are in very difficult situations. They'll experience incredible hardship due to poverty, including sometimes deaths due to inability to afford antibiotics and deaths of dysentery, things that are easily preventable, deaths from malnutrition, deaths from dirty drinking water. And then we get up into the global middle and upper class. And when we start thinking about the global upper, middle, and high income countries, then we're talking about $10,000 a year and up. So upper middle to high income countries, they were talking about at the low end, your Mexico at an average of about $10,000 a year. Canada, where average income is around $20,000 a year, or the United States, where it's around $30,000 a year. This is individual, not by home, right? Individual average earnings in the United States, a little above $30,000. In Canada, a little above $20,000. In Mexico, a little above $10,000. Those are all upper middle to high income countries globally. This is what the general economic map distribution looks like. So when you're looking at wealthier countries, Europe, Saudi Arabia, Australia, Japan, to some extent Russia, then middle income countries in Central America, South America, low income countries. We're talking then about Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, some areas in Malaysia, southern China, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, and then your high-income countries, right? United States, Scandinavian countries, Germany. So people who are born in Mumbai, for example, or people who are born in Malaysia, for example, or somebody who is born in Ecuador, right? They have the same intrinsic value, the same intrinsic worth as somebody born in the United States, or somebody born in Germany, or somebody born in Norway. But their likely outcomes are dramatically different, right? There's a basic inequity in the distribution of luck, right? So the place we're born is not something we deserve in the sense of having earned it. People are born into wealthy countries have an unearned advantage, right? I was born in the United States. I don't deserve that. I didn't deserve to be born in the United States any more than somebody who was born in Mumbai or Haiti deserved to be born in Haiti, right? You don't earn, you don't deserve your place of birth. You're either lucky or unlucky. And people who are born in Haiti or Mumbai, they have an unearned disadvantage. Immigration allows for increased competition and a greater meritocracy. So if you're concerned about honest competition, which will produce meritocratic results, that is, people who are better will win out, then what you would want is the best competing with the best, independent of where they were born. So currently we've got this really tilted playing field, right? If you're born in America, you're playing downhill. If you're born in Haiti, you're playing uphill. So how do we overcome that injustice? If you agree that there's an injustice in the global distribution of wealth, so that some people are born at a significant disadvantage and some people are born at a significant advantage, how do we overcome that injustice? Well, there's a disjunctive path here. There's a couple of ways we can overcome that injustice. First, if you think we have economic injustice, we have a duty to respond to that injustice. We can take one of two paths. We can either engage in some sort of compensation. That is, we can try to repair the injustice by compensating people who are born at the bottom end of the injustice from people who are born at the top end of the injustice. So if you're born into wealth, if you're born into a wealthy nation, then the wealthy nation is going to compensate people born into poor nations. Okay. That kind of compensation, that sort of compensatory action to overcome injustice in birthplace, can be done through foreign aid, or it can be done through military intervention. The other option, besides these sort of compensatory actions, is a reparative action. Right? That is, if we have a duty to respond to economic injustice, we could, instead of just trying to compensate against the injustice, we could try to fix the injustice. And one of the ways we can do that is through increased immigration. So, if injustice in birthplace entails a duty to respond, it's possible to compensate for inequality of opportunity by immigration, or we could make direct compensatory arrangements. For instance, we could offer foreign aid. Now, foreign aid could include education, environmental impact efforts, production of food or water supplies, infrastructure, the building of agricultural stores, providing of health care, setting up of markets, disaster relief. The most effective way to produce economic prosperity for a community, like dollar for dollar, the best way to produce economic prosperity, is far and away the empowerment and education of women. So the subjugation of women has been one of the biggest drags on human development that we have ever seen. Maybe the biggest drag on human development ever seen. And the reason for this is twofold. One, when you take women and you exclude them from competition in the workplace, in the marketplace, you take half of your natural talent pool and you say, you can't compete. That means we take half of our intellectual resources. We take half of the people. So think about if you're moving a log, right? And I can take just the guys in the room and say, okay, we're going to move the log. You girls sit over there and cheer for us. Or I can say, guys, girls, everybody together, grab a hold and let's pull. Like, which group is going to move the log better? Right? It's the one where everybody's working together, where we get the whole team on board and we don't put half of them on the sideline. So getting women into the marketplace, getting them educated and empowered is important in making our economies run more efficiently and effectively. And then additionally, the empowerment of women leads to some better decision making when it comes to family planning. So we end up with smaller families, we end up with more effective family units where people are less burdened by debt when women have a prominent role in decision making at home. And that only comes with economic empowerment. So by far, statistically, the best way to overcome injustice through foreign aid is through the education of young women, or young girls and women. Now, if injustice in birthplace entails a duty to respond, it's possible to compensate for those inequalities by immigration or by making compensatory arrangements. Foreign aid could mean a number of different things, but when we look at the amount of foreign aid we offer, the United States only offers, as a part of its discretionary budget, less than 1% in overall foreign aid. That is, our development aid to overcome injustice of the global financial situation is less than 1%. So if we chose this route, that would mean dramatically increasing the amount of foreign aid that we offer. So thinking about our amount of foreign aid delivered, the United States delivers less than 1% of our GDP in foreign aid. That puts us at about 22nd in terms of foreign development aid across the world by dollar for dollar matching to GDP. Right. Countries in the top 10 regularly give $2 to $3 more, or 2 to 3 times more on a per dollar basis. Now, there are also some problems with foreign aid, though. So you might want to reconsider if you're thinking, hey, maybe we should just ramp up the foreign aid and limit the immigration. Problems with foreign aid include tyrannical or corrupt governments that prevent foreign aid from getting where it's supposed to be, self-interested aid agencies that siphon off a significant amount of the resources that are meant to go to help this injustice, and sometimes aid is just inefficiently allocated. Now, there are, of course, ways around all of those problems, but they are very real problems. Overcoming injustice can also be done through military intervention. So if injustice in birthplace entails a duty to respond, foreign aid can be useful. Military intervention can also be useful. One way we use military intervention to overcome injustice is by arming locals. We provide arms to local people to fight their own fights against tyranny. Now, here's 2 examples of people we've armed in the last 30 years. We armed these Contras, right? So these are Central American counter-revolutionaries fighting against communism. These arms were transferred to these so-called Contras as part of a arms for hostages deal with Iran, and then we also armed this group headed by Osama bin Laden, right, the Taliban, to fight against Russia when Afghanistan was being invaded by Russia. So these are both groups that we have armed and since regretted arming. Military intervention in the sense of arming locals is difficult. When we're interested in fighting tyrannical or oppressive regimes, it's sometimes hard to find allies on the ground that we can really depend on. Another option is direct intervention. So direct intervention might mean bombing places like Syria, instituting no-fly zones, and shooting down jets and bombers that violate those no-fly zones. That is acts of war. It might also mean setting up and maintaining and defending and supporting long-term refugee camps in places like Syria. This involves lots of opportunity costs, lots of actual costs, and lots of commitment of military personnel across the globe. Now, in most cases, the 70+% of the global population that is born in low-income countries have very little chance to make it into the middle class. That is the middle class of the global economic system. That is those people who are born in countries where the living standard is $4,000 a year and under. They have very little chance of breaking out of that group. Of those who do break into the global middle class, where the global middle class are still making between $4,000 and $10,000 a year, the people who do break out of that group of desperate poverty into the middle class, 80% of them do so by immigrating into a different country. So how do people break out of desperate poverty in the countries that they're born into? 80% of the time, people who break out of those desperate situations do so by finding a country where the economic opportunities are just better. Now, some will object that allowing immigration into wealthier nations will reduce the advantages of being a member of the wealthier nation. And immigration does allow greater competition in wealthy nations. And that's got mixed results. So one of the results of this is competition for jobs. As you have an increasing quantity of labor, the value of each additional unit of labor is reduced. It's a simple supply and demand curve. More competition, lower wages, right? Now, immigrants to the U.S., 50% hold a college degree. These are H-2 visas. They're sometimes called genius visas. That's compared to less than a third of native-born people. So half of the people who immigrate into the United States at present have college degrees, compared to only a third of people who are native-born, although that rate is increasing. Immigrants are twice as likely per capita to start a business as compared to native-born people. So what this means is, one, when immigrants enter this country, they're very likely to have a college degree and go into STEM fields, and for every new immigrant worker in a STEM field, they produce, on average, 2.5 new jobs in support roles. It's also estimated that people with H-1 visas, those are the temporary worker visas for especially for agricultural fields, produce additional jobs in their path as well. Things like farm equipment repair, health and safety, and then sales and production further down the distribution nodes. So according to The Economist, a world of free movement would be $78 trillion richer every year. That is, if we removed the barriers to people moving through borders so that when there were jobs someplace, people could move to take them. We would make the economies of the world more efficient. And in making those economies of the world more efficient, we would produce greater wealth. That is, we would grow the size of the pie by increasing efficiency. Open borders, they're saying, would mean doubling the global economy. Now, this is The Economist. This is not some liberal rag, and these are people who know what they're doing. Open borders would mean doubling the global economy. Now, that is very good for the average person. If you're a utilitarian, you're doing a utilitarian analysis, you want to know what would maximize the overall impact on society. Doubling the economy, that would have a massively positive impact on most people. Even if the distribution of that increase was wildly unequal, it would still be better for most people. Now, a world $78 trillion richer each year would be hugely beneficial. But some individuals who currently have advantageous positions would lose out in the transition. And so there's a very real concern that some people will act in a nativist way here and say, it's important to me that I protect my current position that I've currently got, even if it comes at an expense overall to the society at large. There's a term for this in economics. It's called rent seeking or protectionism. This is using government intervention, that is the securing of borders, say, to protect a monopoly or other advantage, thus making the system less efficient in the process. So when we use government intervention or government regulation to protect our monopoly on jobs, what we're doing is we're saying, I want government regulation to protect me against competition, to secure my advantages against this potential competition. Now, this happens when we exclude things like Uber or Lyft, and we only allow regulated taxi drivers. This is what we do when we have import tariffs and duties. This is what we're doing when we have under-the-table deals with politicians. And this is what happens when unions say, only our people can work in this place. Right? That is saying, us only. We don't want competition from outsiders. Just our people can be here. Right? Now, there's good reason to think that sometimes tariffs, unions, or protectionist policies could make sense, right? To protect a community of people. But to think that that's going to be maximally efficient, or to think that that's going to maximize results on the whole, may be misguided in some cases. At any rate, it's a thing worth considering. So, while some policymakers have blamed immigration for slowing U.S. wage growth since the 1970s, most research finds little long-run effect on American wages. Which is just to say, when you look at the data, and I've pored over a lot of it, it turns out that increased immigration doesn't actually reduce overall wages for Americans. On average, because immigrants produce new jobs, because they produce downstream jobs, and because they innovate, and because they start their own businesses at a higher rate than native-born people, they have a tendency to grow the economy. And in virtue of growing the economy, they don't actually suppress wage growth. The economic evidence suggests that immigration leads to more innovation, a better educated workforce, greater occupational specialization, better matching of skills with jobs, and higher overall economic productivity. First-generation immigrants create about 25% of new firms, new businesses. Immigrants have started more than half of America's startup companies, valued at $1 billion or more. When we allow increased immigration, the people who want to immigrate to the United States are vastly, and for the most part, people who are here to work hard, to make a better living for themselves and their families. That is, they're seeking a fair chance at what the rest of us already have. So immigration also has a net positive effect on combined federal, state, and local budgets. Not all taxpayers benefit equally. Regions with large populations, big cities, and especially ones with less educated, lower income immigrants or native-born residents, bear significant costs due to the use of public services, especially education services. But it's worth noting that in terms of unemployment rates, native-born people and immigrants have very similar long-term trajectories when it comes to unemployment. At times, native-born people have higher rates of unemployment. At present, that's the case. Native-born people have slightly higher rates of unemployment than immigrants do. Immigrants, that is, are more likely to have a job than a native-born person, but only slightly, and that seems to vacillate back and forth within 1% or 2% over the long-term curve. So there's a myth of the immigrant that doesn't work. That's mythology. People don't come here to for the most part. People aren't trying to immigrate so that they can use the social safety net. For the most part, people are coming to immigrate so that they can take advantage of the American dream, to work hard and provide a better life for their families. So the typical immigrant and his or her offspring will pay a net $80,000 more in taxes during their lifetime than they collect in government services. That is, it's a net gain in terms of taxation. And for immigrants with college degrees, the fiscal return is closer to $200,000. It's a very net positive when it comes to the sort of the cost-benefit analysis of immigration. But of course, we have to look at more than just the rights of people involved, the justice elements, or the cost-benefit analysis. We also have to consider the cultural impact of immigration. So nations have a distinctive character. The United States is a nation based on liberty and innovation, right? Where we are the country that we are because of our political, technical, and cultural innovations, right? So this is the country that gave the world the constitutional democracy. This is the country that gave the world the automobile, electricity, the car, Hollywood movies, the blues, jazz, and rock and roll. The United States is based, at its root, who we are, is a nation defined by the values of freedom and innovation. I submit to you. We are also a nation of immigrants. We're a nation of the Mayflower, of Ellis Island, and the Irish potato famine. Now, nations have a distinctive character, and immigrants arrive with different traditions, different languages, different political assumptions. Those things matter. Over time, immigrants adopt new traditions, new languages, new practices. This process is called assimilation. Over half of immigrants from the period of 2000 to 2012, people who immigrated from 2000 to 2012, spoke English proficiently for the 2012 census. So more than half of immigrants spoke proficient English within the first 12 years of their immigration. So there is a very real process of assimilation into the new linguistic and cultural communities. In fact, Hispanic Americans are more likely than European Americans to say the U.S. is the best country when asked in a national survey. That is, immigrants are proud of the United States. Now, in 1891, speaking about the Irish immigrants who had just begun arriving in mass to the United States, Henry Cabot Lodge, senator from Massachusetts, described immigration as, quote, bringing to the country people whom it is very difficult to assimilate, and who do not promise well the standard of civilization in the United States. Right, so Henry Cabot Lodge talking about all of these damn Irish immigrants, saying how what they're doing is they're going to ruin the culture of the country. They barely speak the language, they have smelly food, the Roman Catholics. They'll never fit in to the culture of the United States. And if you look at the country now, the St. Patrick's Day parades, the Supreme Court traditions, the presidency, the Senate, you've got Irish descendants in law enforcement, military, politics, cuisine, never mind the whiskey, the bourbon. What could be more American than bourbon? Sorry, I'm a Southern man, so bourbon's important to me. and we wouldn't have that quintessentially American thing. We wouldn't have that without these Irish immigrants. Now, the cultural impact is not to be thought of in just one direction, though, because the host society also changes. The host society also adjusts and changes at the influence of immigrants. So we get things like bratwurst and beer when increase in beer. When we get German immigration. We get whiskey and Valentine's Day and St. Patrick's Day with Irish immigration. With Italian immigration, we get pizza and pasta. And now we get burritos and tacos and tequila and the Day of the Dead. Now, these are small tokens, symbols of things that seem very American to us. Bratwurst and beer, whiskey and St. Patrick's Day, pizza and pasta. These feel American to me. And that's because they've been incorporated into what it is to be American by immigrants over our history. And to think that that's going to stop now is probably mistaken. So, immigration means that the U.S. culture will change. But that's normal. It's also important. What's less clear is what cultural changes we should want and how we should go about obtaining them. Now, here's 3 things I think that we should want to change about our culture. Things that we should want to obtain about our culture. We want to obtain and keep and develop and grow our sense of pride and liberty, our sense of family, and our dedication and hard work as a people. Those are values we want immigrants to have. We want immigrants to value liberty, we want them to value family, and we want them to value hard work. Now, here's the general trajectory of immigration in the United States. From at the early end, around 1800, to I believe this graph is from 2014. It starts off that almost all of the immigration in this country is from Germany, Italy, Ireland, England. A little bit from Canada, some Asians, not many, some Latin Americans. Now, as that number of immigrants dropped off, and it reaches a valley in the 70s, right? So we get this low point of immigration in the 1970s. And then an expansion from then to its historic high. Right, so at peak immigration to the United States, we had about 15% of the population of the United States was foreign born. Most of them from Germany, Italy, Ireland, or some other European continental location. Now we are at about 13% total population foreign born. And the predominant groups are from Central and South America and Mexico. That's this blue section. If you can see this line here, this group is from Mexico, and then this lighter blue is from other Latin American countries. We also have increased immigration from Asia. So this orange section, that's India and China primarily. And then the blue section here is immigration from Africa, the other expanding group. So we are not yet, at our historical moment, at an equivalent peak of our previous peak of immigration. But we are approaching that level of immigration, the one that we were at just after the Irish potato famine and in the years between then and the Roaring Twenties. Right, so we had a decrease in immigration basically after the Roaring Twenties. You had this economic downturn, and then around the 70s we had a low-end immigration, and it's been on the increase since then. Now, about the cultural impact of this shift on the question of assimilation. Some Supreme Court cases about assimilation, or a Supreme Court case about the right of the Japanese to become citizens. There's a question in one of these cases that came before the Supreme Court about assimilation, and briefs were submitted on each side. One titled, "The Japanese are assimilable," that is, they can assimilate, they can become American, and one saying the Japanese cannot become American. Now, in the latter, the respondent, the brief writer, argued that what made Japanese like, quote, "the Negro, the Indian, and the Chinaman," end quote, unassimilable, are their immutable, marked physical characteristics. Now, this is obviously absurd. Right? It's obviously ridiculous to think that the only people who can be part of this culture, who can assimilate to the nation's values, these values of liberty, family, and hard work, it's ridiculous to think that those are marked by physical characteristics. That the color of your skin, the shape of your face, the size of your body, that these are the features that determine your commitment to family, liberty, and hard work. To the contrary, we have a commitment as a people to the view that we each are worthy of dignity, no matter our skin color or our birthplace. But what assimilation means, right? What the United States is about is in some ways summarized by this statement, ex pluribus unum, from many one. Now, the idea of the United States as a melting pot is first coined by a French immigrant in 1782. He wrote, "Individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men, whose labors and posterity will one day cause great changes in the world." The idea here is that as a crucible melts different kinds of metal to produce an alloy that's stronger and sharper than the previous base metal, similarly, the crucible of the United States melts together disparate people into one common American identity. It's not that we have different pockets of people all getting American sauce splashed on them. It's instead that when immigrants confront the United States and the United States confronts these immigrants, what happens is We blend into each other. The heat of that contrast causes the two sides to each melt into one another. And we both come away from that sharper and stronger, a better alloy than we started. More innovative, more advancing, more technologically sophisticated, more concerned with preserving the liberties that allow us to live our lives the way we choose, and still more and more dedicated to the hard work required to make our lives better. So when thinking about the impact of immigration, the Cato Institute argues, quote, "Successive waves of immigrants have kept our country demographically young, enriched our culture, and added to our productive capacity as a nation, enhancing our influence in the world." That is, what immigration does is it provides the raw materials to be the country that is leading the momentum of the world. Now, a thing we haven't talked about yet is immigration and security. The conversation before now has been about the parameters and justifications for legal immigration. And so far we have not talked at all about illegal immigration. And there's of course a relationship between legal and illegal immigration. But here we should focus on the former. When thinking about immigration and security, it's important to remember that 1 in 25 foreign nationals who enter the United States come here to immigrate. The rest are here as business travelers, on student visas, or as tourists. Some just over shopping from Canada or Mexico or to visit friends or family for the day with no intention of staying permanently. So if we're worried about security and securing the safety of the United States, worrying about immigrants doesn't begin to solve that problem. And to reduce the number of foreign nationals entered in the United States on the 25 side instead of the 1 side would mean having no more international tourism, reducing international business to a crawl, shutting down our research institutions that are taking the best and the brightest from across the world. To do that in the name of security would be to cut off our economic engine, to violate the sense of liberty, of freedom of movement of these people for the sake of security. Now, only 1 in 25 foreign nationals come here to immigrate. So the security concern of immigration can't be that. And if we look at the recent terrorist attacks, so look at September 11th, for instance, of those 19 terrorists who attacked the United States, none of them applied for immigration. None of them sought to become U.S. citizens. They entered on temporary tourist and student visas. All right, so if we're concerned about security, those are a much greater source of security threats. But they're also very important to the full functioning of our economy and to the full functioning of the liberty that we seek to protect as a nation. Now, we could reduce the number of immigrants to 0, and we still wouldn't stop terrorists from slipping into the country on non-immigrant visas. To defend ourselves better against terrorism, our border control system requires a reorientation of mission. For the last 2 decades, U.S. immigration policy has been obsessed with catching mostly Mexican-born workers whose crime was that they wanted to earn an honest day's pay for an honest day's work. So when we raid slaughterhouses or restaurants and we arrest workers who pose no threat to national security, we shouldn't do that on the grounds of national security. So where do we go from here? What do we do about immigrants currently in the country illegally? First, we should just recognize that deporting all of the illegal immigrants or the immigrants in the country illegally is just unrealistic. That's just not going to happen. It's not a plausible solution. At the same time, we don't want to provide citizenship as a reward for morally dubious behavior. So a compromise solution would be to allow H-1 visas leading to permanent residence. This would bring people into the culture and encourage taxation. It would allow people to build lives, buy homes, start families, and encourage the kind of assimilation that we would like to have in a melting pot. Of course, it also threatens to turn the United States into a class-divided society. So if we stop that immigration process at the H-1 visa or the permanent resident status, then what we end up with is a permanent underclass, a group of people who have no real say in the political operation of the nation that they're a part of, who have no vote, who are being taxed without any representation. And as a nation, that inhibits assimilation, that inhibits cultural unity, and so that may present a bit of a problem. Fortunately, that's a single generational problem. When we look at the so-called dreamers, that is, children born in another country but brought to this country while still school age, that is, people who were brought to this country who had no choice in the matter, who were brought here by parents seeking a better life for themselves and their kids. What the DREAM Act allows is first temporary residency, which is conditional. That is that these young people have to meet the conditions that they have no criminal convictions and they could continue educational progress through elementary, middle, high school, and college. And if they meet those conditions, then they can be granted permanent residency, a green card, after 5 years. And then they can provide, after that term of 5 years, applications for citizenship. Now, if we take seriously the idea that we want hardworking people, that we want people who identify as Americans, that we want to have in this country justice and liberty, then we can have that. But part of what it means to do that is to allow, at minimum, dreamers to stay. I hope you found some of this useful, and I hope you have a great day.